Ghostly tales, yet mirrors of human life. Hey everyone! Welcome to Encountering Chinese, Ghostly Tales from Zhai. Today, I'm going to tell you a story called Jiefu. Yang Wanshi, a scholar from Daming Prefecture, was known for being extremely fearful of his wife, Yin. Yin was exceptionally fierce, and whenever Yang Wanshi disobeyed her even slightly, he would be beaten with a whip. After Yang Wanshi's father lost his wife in his 60s, Yin treated him like a servant. Yang Wanshi and his younger brother, Yang Wanzhong, would often secretly bring food to their father, but they didn't dare let Yin find out. The old man usually wore only a tattered cotton jacket to keep warm, and out of fear of being ridiculed, Yin forbade him from seeing guests. Yang Wanshi, at 40 years old, still had no sons, so he took Wang as a concubine, but he didn't dare speak a word to her all day. Once, while the Yang brothers were in the county waiting for an exam, they met a young man whose appearance and clothing were elegant and refined. The brothers engaged in conversation with him and found they shared similar interests. When they asked the young man for his name, he replied, "My surname is Ma, and my given name is Jiefu." From then on, the three of them became increasingly close, eventually burning incense, forming an alliance, and swearing brotherhood. About half a year after the two brothers parted ways with Ma Jiefu, he suddenly came to visit the Yang family, accompanied by his servants. At that moment, old Yang was squatting outside the door, basking in the sun and picking lice from his clothes. Ma Jiefu thought the old man was the Yang family's old servant, so he gave his name and asked him to inform the master. Hearing this, old Yang put on his tattered cotton jacket and went inside. Just then, someone passing by told Ma Jiefu, "That old man is actually the father of the Yang brothers." Ma Jiefu was taken aback, and just as he was processing this, the Yang brothers, dressed simply, came out to greet him. After they all exchanged greetings in the hall, Ma Jiefu requested to meet their father. Yang Wanshi could only decline, saying that his father was feeling unwell. The three of them then sat close together, chatting and laughing until they lost track of time. As it got late, Yang Wanshi mentioned several times that dinner had been prepared, but no food appeared. The brothers took turns going in and out, urging the servants to bring the meal, but all that came was a weak servant carrying a pot of wine. The wine quickly ran out, and the three continued to wait for a long time. Yang Wanshi, anxious and embarrassed, kept going back and forth to the kitchen, his face flushed with heat and sweat. After some time, the same frail servant finally brought out a meal, but it was coarse rice, half-cooked, and tasted awful. After the meal, Yang Wanshi hurried away, leaving Yang Wanzhong to accompany their guest in the guest room. Late at night, as the two of them chatted, Ma Jiefu scolded Yang Wanzhong, saying, "Earlier, I thought you two were men of great character, which is why I swore brotherhood with you. Now, I see that your father can't even get enough to eat, something that would bring shame to any stranger." Hearing this, Yang Wanzhong began to weep and said, Our family circumstances are difficult to explain in such a short time. Misfortune has befallen the Yang family. My brother married a fierce wife who tyrannizes everyone in the household. If you weren't such a sincere brother, I wouldn't dare to reveal such a disgraceful secret. Ma Jiefu, shocked and dismayed, remained silent for a long while before finally saying, I had planned to leave early tomorrow morning, but now that I've heard such a strange tale, I can't leave without seeing this woman for myself. Please lend me a spare room so that I can cook my own meals. Yang Wanzhong agreed and immediately prepared a modest side room for Ma Jiefu. Late at night, he secretly brought Ma Jiefu many vegetables and grains, fearing that Yin would find out. Ma Jiefu, understanding his predicament, graciously declined these offerings. Ma Jiefu then invited old Yang to stay and eat with him and even went to the city to buy new clothes for the old man. The Yang family, father and sons alike, were moved to tears by Ma Jiefu's actions. Yang Wanzhong had a 7-year-old son named Shir, who liked to sleep with his grandfather at night. Ma Jiefu patted the child and said, This child's fortune and longevity will surpass that of his father, though his youth will be marked by hardship. Before long, Yin heard about old Yang's newfound comfort and was furious. She cursed Ma Jiefu for meddling in others' family affairs. At first, her tirades were confined to the inner courtyard, but gradually, she began to curse right in front of Ma Jiefu's quarters, even doing so when Ma Jiefu was present. The Yang brothers, drenched in sweat and pacing anxiously, did not dare to intervene, while Ma Jiefu acted as if he hadn't heard a thing. When Yin discovered that Yang Wanzhong's concubine, Wang, was 5 months pregnant, she ordered her stripped of her clothes and severely beaten. After the beating, she forced Yang Wanzhong to kneel, put a woman's headscarf on him, and chased him out with a whip. Ma Jiefu happened to witness all of this from outside. Deeply ashamed, Yang Wanzhong was frozen in place, but when Yin pressed him further, he finally left the house. Still unsatisfied, Yin followed him outside, arms akimbo, stomping her feet, and continuing to curse, while a crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. At that moment, Ma Jiefu pointed at Yin and sternly commanded, Go, go. Yin immediately turned and ran as if she were being chased by a ghost, leaving behind her pants, shoes, and even her foot bindings scattered along the road. She ran barefoot into the house, her face as pale as death. After taking a moment to compose herself, the maidservants brought her shoes and socks. She put them on and began to wail loudly, but no one in the household dared to ask her about it. Ma Jiefu then dragged Yang Wanzhong over and removed the headscarf from his head, but Yang Wanzhong stood stiffly, holding his breath as if terrified that the removal of the headscarf would bring about some calamity. Ma Jiefu forcibly untied the scarf, but Yang Wanzhong remained uneasy, afraid that Yin would blame him for allowing someone else to take it off. Only after he was certain that Yin's crying had stopped did he dare to enter the house, though he approached with hesitation. Yin, without saying a word, suddenly got up and went to her bedroom to sleep alone. Only then did Yang Wanzhong feel a sense of relief, secretly marveling at what had happened along with his brother. The family found the situation strange and gathered to discuss it. Yin overheard their murmuring, which only deepened her shame and anger. In her fury, she whipped all the servants. Yin then called for Wang, but Wang, severely injured, was unable to get up. Yin, thinking that Wang was pretending, began to beat her in bed, causing Wang to bleed profusely and suffer a miscarriage. Young Wancher wept secretly in front of Ma Jiefu, who comforted and consoled him. Ma Jiefu then ordered his servants to prepare food and drink, and as the night wore on, he still did not allow young Wancher to return home. Yin sat in her boudoir, seething with anger that her husband had not yet returned. Just as her fury was at its peak, she heard the sound of someone prying at the door. She hurriedly called for her maidservant, but the door had already been broken, leaving a gaping hole. A giant figure entered, his shadow looming over the entire room. The giant's face was terrifying, like that of a demon. Moments later, a few more figures entered, each holding a sharp blade. Yin was petrified at the sight and tried to scream, but the giant pressed his knife against her throat and threatened. "Scream, and I'll kill you." Yin then offered to ransom her life with money, but the giant replied, "I am a messenger from the underworld. I have no need for earthly riches, I only seek the heart of a wicked wife." Terrified, Yin kowtowed repeatedly, so fervently that her forehead began to bleed. The giant traced his sharp blade across her chest and began to recount her misdeeds, asking, "I will tell you one thing, you decide if you deserve to die for it." With each sin he listed, he slashed at her body, and by the time he finished, Yin's body was covered with dozens of cuts. Finally, the giant said, "Since the concubine Wang was carrying a child, who was also a descendant of the Yang family, how could you bear to beat her until she miscarried? This is a crime that cannot go unpunished." With that, he ordered the others to tie Yin's hands behind her back and cut open her chest. Yin desperately kowtowed, begging for mercy and repeatedly admitting her wrongdoings. Just then, the sound of the central door opening echoed from outside. The giant said, "Young Wancher has returned. Since she has shown remorse, we will spare her life today." With that, the figures in the room suddenly disappeared in a chaotic rush. Shortly after, young Wancher entered the room and found Yin naked, bound, and covered in crisscrossing knife wounds on her chest. He quickly untied her and asked what had happened. After hearing the story, he was shocked and secretly suspected that Ma Jiefu had been involved. The next day, young Wancher mentioned the incident to Ma Jiefu, who was also surprised. From that point on, Yin's domineering attitude gradually waned, and for several months, she did not dare utter a single harsh word. Seeing this, Ma Jiefu was very pleased and privately told young Wancher, "To tell you the truth, don't let this slip out. A few days ago, I used a small magic trick just to scare her a bit. Now that you and your wife have reconciled, it's time for me to bid farewell." With that, he left the Yang household. Every night, Yin would ask young Wancher to stay with her, smiling and flattering him. Young Wancher, who had never experienced such affection from his wife, was bewildered by her sudden warmth, feeling both uneasy and elated. One night, Ian recalled the terrifying image of the giant and began trembling with fear. Trying to appease her, young Wancher hinted that the whole incident was just an illusion, not real. Ian immediately sat up and pressed him for details. Realizing his slip, young Wancher knew he couldn't take back his words and reluctantly confessed the truth. Upon hearing this, Ian flew into a rage and unleashed a torrent of curses. Young Wancher, terrified, knelt beside the bed, begging for forgiveness, but Ian ignored him. He pleaded until the middle of the night, when Ian finally said, "If you want me to forgive you, you must cut as many wounds on your chest as I had on mine. Only then will I be satisfied." With that, she actually got up to fetch a kitchen knife. Terrified, young Wancher fled, with Ian chasing after him, causing an uproar in the household. The entire family was awakened by the commotion. Young Wanzhong, not knowing why his sister-in-law wanted to kill his brother, tried to protect him with his body, moving left and right. While Ian was cursing, she suddenly noticed Yang's father approaching. Seeing him dressed in new clothes, her fury intensified. She rushed forward and slashed at him with the knife, cutting his clothes into strips, slapping his face, and pulling out his beard. Finally, young Wanzhong could no longer bear it and threw a stone at Ian, striking her on the head and knocking her to the ground, unconscious. Young Wanzhong said, "I have killed the wicked woman, and I am willing to pay for it with my life. But at least father and brother can survive. What more could I regret?" He then threw himself into a well, and by the time they pulled him out, he had already died. After a while, Ian unexpectedly regained consciousness. When she learned that young Wanzhong had died, her anger subsided. After young Wanzhong was buried, his wife vowed never to remarry, so she could care for their son, Xi'er. Ian, however, continued to torment her sister-in-law, denying her food and eventually forcing her to leave. Xi'er was left alone, helpless, and endured daily beatings from Ian. He was only allowed to eat cold leftovers after the rest of the family had finished their meals. This went on for 6 months, and the child became so weak that he was barely clinging to life. One day, Ma Jiefu suddenly arrived. Young Wancher instructed the family not to inform Ian. Ma Jiefu was shocked to see that Yang's father was still dressed in rags as before and was deeply saddened to hear of young Wanzhong's death. Xi'er, upon hearing that Ma Jiefu had arrived, came to greet him and affectionately called him Uncle Ma. Ma Jiefu could hardly recognize him and stared at him for a while before recognizing him. Ma Jiefu, astonished, said, "Child, how have you become so emaciated?" Young Wancher's father hesitated but eventually recounted the events. Ma Jiefu, angered, said to young Wancher, "I told you before that you were not human, and I was right. You and your brother only have this one child left. If he dies, how will the Yang family have any descendants?" Young Wancher had no reply and stood by, silently weeping. After talking for a while, Ian learned that Ma Jiefu had arrived. She was too afraid to confront Ma Jiefu directly, so she called young Wancher into the inner room, slapped him, and forced him to sever his ties with Ma Jiefu. Young Wancher came out with tears in his eyes and clear handprint marks on his face. Ma Jiefu, furious, said, "Brother, you can't stand up to your wife? Can't you just divorce her? She beats your father and caused the death of your brother, and you still endure it quietly. Are you even human?" Young Wancher stood up, seemingly moved by Ma Jiefu's words. Ma Jiefu further provoked him. "If she doesn't leave, you should use force to drive her away. Even if you have to kill her, don't be afraid. I have a few friends in high positions who will surely help you and ensure you're not wronged." Young Wancher agreed, and in his rage, he quickly went to the inner room. He happened to collide with Yin, who scolded him, "What are you doing?" Young Wancher, panic-stricken, fell to the ground and said, "Ma Jiefu told me to divorce you." Yin, infuriated, began searching for a weapon, while young Wancher fled in fear. Ma Jiefu spat at him and said, "Brother, you are hopeless." He then opened his chest and took out a small spoon of medicine, mixed it with water, and handed it to young Wancher, saying, "This will make you fearless of your wife. I usually don't use it because it's harmful to humans. But since it's absolutely necessary now, you should try it." After drinking the medicine, young Wancher soon felt his anger burning like a raging fire. Unable to endure it for even a moment, he rushed into the inner room, shouting like thunder. Before Yin could even ask, young Wancher kicked her several feet away and then pummeled her with his fists, landing blows as if it were raining. Yin was nearly beaten to a pulp but continued to curse. Young Wancher took out his sword and, despite Yin's threats, cut a palm-sized piece of flesh from her thigh and threw it on the ground. As he was about to cut more, Yin begged for mercy, but young Wancher ignored her pleas and continued. Seeing young Wancher's ferocity, the family members rushed to pull him away with their lives at stake. Ma Jiefu came forward, grabbed young Wancher's arm, and comforted him. Young Wancher, still furious, repeatedly tried to go back inside to deal with Yin, but Ma Jiefu stopped him. Gradually, the effects of the medicine wore off, and young Wancher returned to his disheveled state. Ma Jiefu advised young Wancher, "Don't get discouraged. Rebuild yourself and make a fresh start. Fear of something isn't formed overnight, it builds up over time. My help this time is to give you a new lease on life. You should change your old habits and behave differently. Don't get discouraged again, or I won't be able to help you." He sent young Wancher back inside to check on the situation. Yin, trembling and scared, had her maid assist her to kneel and apologize to her husband. Young Wancher stopped her from doing so and informed Ma Jiefu of everything that had happened. The young family was very pleased with the outcome. As Ma Jiefu prepared to leave, young Wancher and his father tried to persuade him to stay. Ma Jiefu replied, "I'm on my way to the East Sea, so I just happened to visit on my way. We can see each other again when I return." More than a month later, Yin had recovered and was serving her husband with respect. But as time went on, she began to feel that her husband was merely showing off his limited skills, gradually losing respect for him, and starting to mock and curse him. Before long, Yin returned to her old ways. Yang's father could no longer endure it and fled during the night, becoming a Taoist priest in Hunan. Young Wanshi also dared not search for his father. Over a year later, Ma Jiefu came back to Daming Prefecture. Upon learning about the Yang family's situation, he was furious. After reprimanding young Wanshi, he immediately called for Shear and placed him on a donkey, driving the donkey away. From then on, the villagers looked down upon young Wanshi. When the local education inspector visited Daming Prefecture, he cancelled young Wanshi's status as a scholar due to his poor conduct. Several years later, the Yang family suffered a devastating fire that reduced their property and wealth to ashes and even spread to neighboring houses. The villagers dragged young Wanshi to the county office to file a complaint, resulting in a severe and meticulous fine that depleted the Yang family's remaining assets, leaving them without a place to live. Nearby villagers advised against renting their houses to young Wanshi, and Yin's brothers, enraged by her actions, refused to accept them. With no other options, young Wanshi pawned his concubine, Wang, to a wealthy family for some money and took Yin with him across the river to Hunan. By the time they arrived in Hunan, they had exhausted all their funds. Yin, unwilling to continue living with young Wanshi, demanded to remarry. A butcher who had lost his wife bought her for 300 coins. Young Wanshi wandered from village to village, begging for food. One day, he came to a wealthy household but was rebuffed by the doorman who wouldn't let him near. After a while, an official came out, and young Wanshi knelt on the ground, sobbing. The official looked at him for a long time, then asked his name, exclaiming, "Uncle, how did you fall into such poverty?" Young Wanshi then recognized the official as Shear, and they both broke down in tears. Shear took him inside, where the hall was decorated in gold and splendor. Soon, young Wanshi's father, supported by a young servant, came out. The father and son were moved and choked with emotion as they reunited. Young Wanshi then recounted his hardships. It turned out that Ma Jiefu had brought Shear to this place, and shortly thereafter, went back to find young Wanshi's father and brought him to live with them. He had also arranged for Shear to have a tutor to study. At 15, Shear passed the imperial exams to become a Shiozai, and the following year, he became a Juren. Ma Jiefu also arranged a marriage for him. As Ma Jiefu prepared to leave, the grandfather and grandson tearfully tried to persuade him to stay. Ma Jiefu revealed, "Actually, I am not human but a fox spirit. My fellow immortals have been waiting for me for a long time. I must leave now." With that, he vanished. Recalling these events, Shear was deeply moved. He also remembered the cruel treatment his aunt Wang had endured and was even more saddened. He sent money and carriages to redeem Wang. Over a year later, Wang had another son, and young Wanshi made her his legitimate wife. Meanwhile, Yin, who had followed the butcher, remained as stubborn and unruly as before. The butcher, furious, impaled her thigh with a knife, threaded a pig's hair rope through the wound, and hung her from a beam. He then left with his pig meat. Een screamed desperately until her voice was hoarse, and only then did the neighbors hear and come to her aid. They untied her and removed the pig hair rope, each pull causing her to scream in agony, the sound echoing throughout the neighborhood. From then on, she would tremble with fear at the sight of the butcher and dared not speak. Although her leg wound eventually healed, the hair splinters remained embedded in her flesh, causing her to walk with difficulty. Despite this, she had to work hard from dawn till dusk and could not afford to slack off. The butcher, having set a precedent for brutality, became even more reckless. Whenever he came home drunk, he would beat and curse her mercilessly. Only then did Een begin to realize the cruelty she had inflicted upon others in the past. One day, Shir's wife, Yang, and his aunt, Wang, went to Putua Temple to offer incense. The local village women came to pay their respects, and Een stood among the crowd, feeling dejected and afraid to approach. Wang deliberately asked, "Who is that woman?" A servant stepped forward and reported, "She is the wife of Zhang the butcher." The attendants then scolded her, ordering her to bow to the ladies. Wang smiled and remarked, "She married a butcher, so she should have plenty of meat to eat. Why does she look so emaciated?" Een, feeling both ashamed and angry, contemplated suicide by hanging when she got home, but the rope was not sturdy enough, and she survived. This incident made the butcher increasingly disgusted with her. Over a year later, the butcher died. Een encountered young Wanshi on the road and crawled towards him on her knees, tears streaming down her face. Young Wanshi, embarrassed in front of his servants, did not say a word to her. When he got home and told his nephew about the encounter, he wanted to bring Een back, but his nephew strongly opposed the idea. Een was despised by the villagers and had no place to call home, surviving only by begging. Young Wanshi would often visit her in a dilapidated temple. Shir believed this behavior tarnished the family reputation and secretly instructed beggars to insult young Wanshi, causing him to sever ties with Een. As for what happened afterward, I, the writer, did not investigate further. Thus, the story ends here. Alright. That's all for today's ghostly tale, Jiefu. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Please also encourage everyone to comment and share more. We'll see you in the next episode.